Okay, this is another video about Richard III, and it's about what Richard III can teach us today and can teach politicians today. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, since the discovery of Richard's bones in Leicester, why should we be caring and why should we be spending so much money on someone who died 500 years ago? Well, the answer is because I think that we can still learn in Britain today, probably more than ever in fact, before, some important political lessons from Richard III, who I do believe was one of our finest kings. Now, what kind of lessons can we learn from Richard III? Well, the first lesson is about standards in public life. Now, obviously over the last few years we've lived through things like the MP's expenses scandal, and the problem of sleaze has been around in politics for a long time, but we can all think of examples of it. Well, if there's one thing that Richard III stood for and was opposed to, it was sleaze and things like financial corruption in public life. You find hostility to sleaze throughout Titulus Regis, which was the law that established that Richard was the rightful king of England. And in Titulus Regis, you find lots of detail about how the previous king, Edward IV's regime, was riddled with various forms of corruption and sleaze, and that basically Edward spent all of his time sleeping with umpteen different women and sort of having massive banquets and things, rather than actually concentrating on running the country, and also used things like benevolences to kind of impose kind of random taxes on the public, so then that money could be wasted on sleaze. It was basically the medieval version of the MPs fiddling their expenses. Well, Richard put a stop to that, and what Richard did is not only outlaw benevolences, just raising random cash to waste it, but also sought to clean up the court. So you didn't have this waste, you didn't have this sleaze. So in many ways, Richard was a moral individual who acted to clean out the sleaze from public life. And so that's one lesson we can learn from Richard today, and it's a lesson that politicians would be well advised to learn. The second lesson we can learn from Richard III today is about the North-South Divide in this country, which still very much exists in 2013. The southeast of England is still one where much sort of effort is made by the government, and where you find lots of prosperity. And then there are places in the north, particularly in the northeast, which are basically just allowed to sort of sink. It's been like that certainly since the 1980s, with the closing of the coal mines and things, and huge swathes of parts of the north and Wales have just been left to sort of languish in poverty with the closure of the steel industry, etc. Well, if there's one thing that Richard III was opposed to, was the perpetuation of this kind of north-south divide, this kind of unfair treatment of the north of England. One of the things that Richard III has sometimes been criticised for is the policy of Plantation, of bringing people down from the north and putting them into positions of power. But you have to ask yourself, who are the people that criticise that? They're the people in the south who felt threatened by equal opportunities for northerners. In other words, Richard III was a believer in equal opportunity for people from the north as well as people from the south, and was prepared to use positive discrimination to achieve it. Now, you might well be saying, but his motivation was that he didn't have enough support in the south because of Buckingham's rebellion, so he was forced to over-rely on his northern affinity. Well, whatever his motivation, the fact was Richard III had run the north of England for a long time before he became king. He believed in the north of England, and he was prepared to do something about the north-south divide by getting people from the north into positions of power across the whole country. And that makes Richard a believer in equal opportunities and in getting rid of the north-south divide. So, the second lesson we can learn is about the North-South Divide. The third thing we can learn from Richard III, and politicians really today need to learn this one, is about legal issues and the law, and about using the law to achieve fairness for poorer people. Now, you might be aware that at the moment the government is planning to slash spending on legal aid. It's the system which allows anyone who can't afford a lawyer to get a lawyer, when they're dragged in front of the courts and, may well be innocent of what they're charged with. Well, Richard III was the ruler of this country that introduced a system of legal aid for poorer people for the first time. And not just that, it was Richard III that introduced the idea of bail into this country. The idea that if you're arrested for something and you're charged with something, they don't just lock you up for a year until your trial comes through. That you actually can get out on bail if you put some money forward, so that you can't just be kept in when you're innocent, probably, because there's no guarantee that you're guilty, but you're locked up with other prisoners. So that's just two ways in which Richard III used legal reforms to make the judicial system fairer. And at a time when the government seems to be using reform to make the judicial system less fair, I think that's a major lesson that we can learn from Richard III. Finally, the fourth thing that we can learn from Richard III is about Ireland. Richard III's father, Richard Duke of York, had been governor of Ireland for a time, an extremely popular governor of Ireland. And, the Yorkists and the Yorkist dynasty remained very popular in Ireland. It's one of the reasons that so many Irish people supported the Lambert-Simnel rebellion against Henry Tudor in 1487. And Richard himself was popular over there. And I know it's pushing it a bit to say that if Richard had won the Battle of Bosworth, there wouldn't have been later problems between England and Ireland. But it may well have been the case that had Richard III and his Yorkist descendants ruled this country instead of the Tudors, you may not have had something like Elizabeth I's brutal conquest of Ireland take place later. And you may well have avoided some of the massive issues that we've had over the centuries between England and Ireland, going right up to the Irish Troubles in the 20th and 21st century. So Ireland is another thing that we can maybe learn something about by looking at the reign of Richard III. So overall, does Richard III have something to teach us today, politicians today? Well, yes, in some very important ways. Richard III stood for standards in public life. He stood for equality between the North and the South, and Richard stood for fair treatment of everyone through the legal system. And if politicians actually followed some of those things today, I do think that this country would be a much better place. So, those people that follow Richard's reign today, Ricardians, I think Ricardians have a lot to teach the politicians today. Anyway, thanks for listening.